Hello everyone and welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Photography. Welcome to lesson number 5 of module 1. Here's a very interesting fact for you. The very first colour photograph was made by the 3-colour method, which was theorised by James Clerk Maxwell in 1885, but it wasn't until 1861 that it was taken and created by Thomas Sutton. And the subject is this coloured ribbon, which is usually described as a tartan ribbon. Now, Thomas Sutton is a very interesting character in himself because he also went on then to create the world's first SLR camera as well. A huge advancement in photography technology. So the very first colour photograph all the way in 1861, but of course it wasn't until the mid-20th century really that colour photography became very, very popular. So I hope you find that as interesting as I do. You are here with myself, William Eames, your course educator. I hope everybody is really excited about this lesson. We have a lot to cover in this lesson, and I suppose this is one of our first big challenges as a photographer, is learning all about shutter speed. More on that on just a moment. As usual, the key to success to all of these classes is to attend them. Keep attending them and you are going to see your photography improve on every single lesson. And of course, any questions or any issues or problems or anything like that at all, you can chat with Morpheus and indeed put your questions to the classroom as well. So I hope everybody has been enjoying the course up to this stage, and I really hope that you have learned something that you've been able to use to improve your photography so far. Certainly with our composition lesson, there's a lot of things in there that you can start to apply to your photography straight away. But this lesson is very important. This is where we begin to take control over our photography. It's one of the key parts to our fully manual mode, our shutter speeds, but we're going to look at them on their own in this lesson because there's actually a huge amount that we can do just by controlling shutter speeds before we start bringing in our apertures and our ISOs as well. So remember, going back to our very first lesson, we introduced the exposure triangle, and I have a very simplified version of this exposure triangle, which is just our light, our time, and our sensitivity, our ISO. And we're going to have a look at time. So shutter speed is one part of this exposure triangle. It controls the amount of time, the amount of duration that light is allowed to expose the camera's sensor for. So we're all about time in this lesson, and indeed of course we'll be having a look at light, which is our apertures, in the next lesson, and then in the final lesson we'll be talking all about sensitivity and ISO. But focusing on shutter speed. So if you have an old SLR camera from the 70s or the 80s, you may be familiar with this. This is our shutter speed dial. So shutter speeds, basically they will allow us to set the amount of time that the shutter opens and closes for. So the shutter is like a little curtain that sits just in front of our film or our camera's image sensor that moves out of the way to allow light to pass through it to expose a scene. But we can choose for how long that remains open. We can set a fast shutter speed or a slow shutter speed. If we need more light, we tend to set a slower shutter speed to allow more light, a longer period of time to allow more light to reach the camera's imaging sensor. If we need less light, we set a faster shutter speed so that the light has less time to reach the camera's imaging sensor. Now, we typically deal with fractions of a second when we're talking about shutter speeds. So the key thing to understand here is that the bigger the number, that doesn't mean the slower the shutter speed. So here we've got 1,000th of a second, okay, a 500th of a second, 250th of a second. This is in red, 125th of a second, because this is the camera's flash sync speed. This is something much more advanced we'll talk about at a much later stage, and so on. These ones here in orange, we're then dealing with actual seconds. So we've got 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, etc. So this is how it would have appeared, or does appear, on our older SLR cameras. On modern DSLRs, we tend to find it on our camera's LCD screens. You can see it here, it's just 320, that's 320th of a second. What you'll also find on modern DSLRs is that they actually have far more shutter speeds available to them than compared to our film SLRs. But you'll find it on your camera's LCD, whether it's on the top one, if you have one on the back, or you'll definitely see it through your camera's viewfinder or electronic viewfinder as well. It's very, very important to identify where they're located on your camera, because you're going to be using them an awful lot. So if you're not sure, do be sure to check out your camera's user manual, and you'll definitely find a section on shutter speeds and where to locate them. So if we think back to lesson number 2, when we had a look at how our DSLR works. So in that lesson, we saw that light enters our lens. We press our exposure button to allow the mirror to move out of the way and for the light to reach our camera's imaging sensor. Now, that's not the full truth of what actually happens when we press our exposure button. And located just behind the mirror and just in front of our camera's imaging sensor is what's known as the shutter curtain. The shutter curtain. And when we press our exposure button, the mirror moves up out of the way, but also the shutter curtain will also open to allow light to pass through simultaneously. So when we press our shutter button in our DSLR, the mirror moves up, but our shutter curtain opens at the exact same time to allow light to pass through to reach our camera's imaging sensor. So that's actually what's happening when we press our exposure button in a DSLR. Now, if we're using a mirrorless camera, or if we're using our phones or anything like that that doesn't happen to have a mirror inside it, basically when we press the shutter button, the shutter curtain simply moves out of the way to allow light to pass through to be recorded onto the image sensor. So regardless of whether you're using a DSLR or whether you're using a mirrorless type camera, the shutter is going to move out of the way to allow light to be recorded onto the sensor. Now, some cameras don't even have that shutter curtain. Some cameras, basically, they will just activate the imaging sensor for the amount of time that you select when you choose your shutter speed. So, for example, in your phone, because phones are so small, they don't have space to have a shutter curtain inside them. So basically, when you record your photograph, when you press the button to take your picture, the image sensor activates to capture that light for the amount of time that you have either selected or that the camera decides is needed for the scene. But let's just visualize that. Let's see how that actually works. So here you can very, very clearly see the shutter curtain. So in this particular case, we have the mirror moved out of the way for this one so that we can actually see the shutter curtain. Now, when we press the shutter button, the curtain moves up out of the way. As you can see, the mirror is also moved out of the way here. And you can now see that the image sensor is exposed to light. Okay, so it's just as simple as that. Now, the actual mechanism is slightly different from camera to camera. So most mechanisms nowadays, they have this kind of shutter that will move vertically. But in older cameras, certainly in film cameras, it actually moves horizontally. But typically this is how it kind of looks when we're taking an exposure. As you can see with the slower shutter speed, it's simply open for a longer duration of time to allow the image sensor to receive light. With a fast shutter speed, you can see that it moves very, very quickly, and it's almost like it paints the image from the top to the bottom. Now, this is a little bit more complicated, but if you're familiar with doing any video at all and you're aware of a phenomenon called rolling shutter, this happens when we're panning and we're moving across using a fast shutter speed, because the top part of the image is being recorded much faster than the bottom part of the image, and this can become an issue when we're actually doing video using fast shutter speeds. But that's a little bit off topic. When we're dealing with still images, you won't have that particular type of issue at all. But it's fascinating to see how it actually works. So that's how our shutter works in the camera. We need to next learn off a few things about our shutter speeds. So to summarize our shutter speeds, camera shutter controls the duration of time, the amount of time that light is entering the camera. And that duration of time, or that length of time, is known as the camera's shutter speed. If we need more light, the shutter is going to be open for a longer duration. So if I take a photograph and I find it's a little bit dark, I can add more light by opening the shutter for a longer duration of time. And then opposite then, if I need less light, the shutter will be open for a shorter duration of time. And shutter speeds are measured in seconds and fractions of a second. Primarily, we're going to be dealing with fractions of a second pretty much on a day-to-day basis, and we'll be using seconds for much longer exposures. We'll speak about doing long exposures at the end of the lesson. So I'm going to just bring up what I call the common shutter speeds. Now, there's a very particular reason that I'm calling these the common shutter speeds. And you may find, if you're already playing around with shutter speeds on your camera, or you're going to do so after the lesson, that you may have far more shutter speeds available to you than are what's shown on screen here. Okay, now there's a very particular reason for that, but we're looking at what I would call the common shutter speeds, and this is going to come back into play a little bit later on in the course. But basically, what we just need to understand for now is that these are fractions of a second. Okay, so we have a quarter of a second all the way down this end, and we have 1/8000th of a second. And even though the 8,000 is a larger number, as we know it traditionally, it's a fraction of a second compared to a quarter of a second. It's extremely fast, a very, very short amount of time, far faster than we can even blink. Now, as I mentioned, these are our slower speeds. So when we're choosing slower shutter speeds, this means more light, but it also has a secondary effect. So as well as adding more light, it actually causes more blur or more motion. So if we're photographing using a slower shutter speed, what's going to happen is if that there's any movement in the scene, it is going to be blurred. We're going to end up with a scene where, say, like this, we have our little running man, that if we're photographing somebody running, they're actually going to be blurred if we're going to use a slower shutter speed. And then the opposite end, we've got our fractions of a second, or really, really fast fractions of a second. These are faster speeds. This means much less light comes into the camera because the shutter is opening up so fast and closing so fast. But this means we get less blur and less motion. So it freezes action. We get a freezing type of effect when we are using faster shutter speeds. So think about this then. So you, as well as being able to kind of add more light or to reduce the amount of light if your camera isn't getting the exposure right, you now also have these two creative decisions that you can make. You can add a little bit of blur to the scene by using a slower shutter speed, or you can freeze that motion a little bit more. If you really want to kind of freeze that action that might be happening, you can use a very, very fast shutter speed. And as I mentioned then, so shutter speeds are going to appear on our camera either as fractions of a second, so like we can see here with, our typical fractions, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, and so on. Or it might just appear as individual numbers like this. So you might just have it as 2, 4, 8, 15, 30, etc. just without the little one in front of it, but these are the exact same. So get familiar with it on your camera. It might just appear ever so slightly different depending on the brand you're using. Seconds are differentiated from our fractions of a second by two little inverted commas. So you will find these little inverted commas when you move into the seconds. And this is really, really important because, you don't want to set your camera to what you think is a 30th of a second when actually it's 30 seconds. Because there is a significant difference there. So you need to be very aware of this. So again, get familiar with how they appear on your camera. But seconds pretty much universally are displayed on any camera with the two little inverted commas there beside it to indicate that you're now working in seconds rather than fractions of a second. So you'll find them, as I mentioned, either on the top of your LCD or in the back of your LCD. As you can see here on this Nikon, it is just displayed without the one in front of it. That's just 100 of a second there. But on the Canon then, you can see that it's 1 slash, in this case, 4,000 of a second. So it's going to vary from camera to camera. And this is why it's very, very important to just keep your user manual handy, so that when you learn something new like this, that you know where it is in your own camera straight away. Now, there is a lot of numbers there, so don't worry if you feel like, oh, I'm not going to remember all of those numbers when it comes to using shutter speeds. First of all, it's a case of practice. The more you practice with them, the more you are just going to become naturally familiar with them. But the thing is to remember that, if you're dealing with these very high numbers, that means you're using a very, very fast shutter speed. You're dealing with these lower numbers. This means you're going to get slower shutter speed and you get more blur in the scene. So let's have a look at how we can control shutter speed. And this is an example of a photograph with a very, very fast shutter speed, because we can see here that all those individual droplets of water have been frozen here. So that's when you would use a really fast shutter speed to get a really great action type shot like this. But I recommend that, to get using shutter speeds, that we should be switching the dial to shutter priority. So if we think back to lesson number 2, when we had a look at our camera's functions and features, I spoke about shutter priority, and this is a semi-automatic mode. So sometimes it appears as TV, which is time value, but this allows us to set the shutter speed. So we can start setting the shutter speed using this, and it's great because the camera will actually just control the rest of the exposure. So we don't need to worry about any other settings. This means it's a great way to practice with different shutter speeds. So this is something that you can do after the lesson. You could do something as simple as, turn on a tap and run the water, or just do something kind of like that, something responsible, instead of wasting water. If you have a fountain or something, if there's a local fountain or something to photograph, this might be a much better option. But basically, you could test something like that with fast and slow shutter speeds to see the different effects that you get. Because controlling shutter speed, as I mentioned, it allows you to freeze motion or to blur motion. So it can be frozen or it can be blurred depending on the shutter speed that you use. So it's a great option to experiment with shutter speeds. But ultimately, our control is still limited, because while we have the creative decision now over whether or not we want to freeze or blur motion, we still don't have some other creative decisions that we'll be exploring in later lessons. So you can control the shutter speed when you've got it set to your S mode by using either the adjustment dial on the front of the camera, or you may find it on the back of the camera as well. Again, it's going to change depending on the type of camera that you are using, but there will be a dial somewhere on the camera that you can use to increase and decrease that shutter speed. Now, it is also possible to set our shutter speed manually, and this is by using an option called bulb mode. So our shutter speeds are going to be limited up to a point. Generally, cameras won't go beyond 30 seconds. So the slowest shutter speed that you'll be able to set is typically up to 30 seconds. If we need to go any slower than this, we can choose our bulb setting. So this might just be in the menu. It may also actually be just an option on your camera's dial. But this will allow you to set the shutter speed for as long as you like. The shutter basically remains open for as long as the exposure button is pressed. So you'd be using this for very long exposures. Like, say, for example, you want to try and capture some star trails, you'd be looking at using bulb mode. If you want to do very long exposure photography to capture some light trails, or perhaps you want to do a little bit of light painting, you would be using the bulb mode. So you can basically set the amount of time manually when you're using this mode. And this is often then used in conjunction with either a cable or a wireless release. So you can imagine if you're trying to press the exposure button to stay open for about 2 or 3 minutes at a time, you can't just stand there with your finger on the exposure button. That's just not going to work. So a cable release will connect to the camera, which will allow you to press the exposure button, but you can then lock it into place. So it'll actually lock this shutter button open for as long as you like, and you just simply unlock it then when you're finished. Or you can also use what's called a wireless remote, which is the exact same thing. The handy thing with a wireless remote is that you could do it from a distance, which means that if you wanted to be in the photograph, you could actually be in the photograph by using a wireless remote. But it'll allow you to lock that exposure in place for as long as you like when using the bulb mode, so that you can do very long exposures and just simply unlock it when you are finished. So if you're ever wondering how that works, well, that's exactly how it works. Now, obviously, these cable and wireless remotes, so they're not just used for bulb mode either. They are actually just really, really handy to have as well. You can pick them up online for your particular camera for very, very cheap. Now, if these aren't an option to you, there is also another option that we can use, not as effective, but we can also use what's called a delayed shutter release. So you'll often see it called a self-timer, depending on the type of camera that you're using. This is available on every single camera. Even your old film SLRs will definitely have this option. Basically, it's just a short delay before the camera actually takes the exposure. And this is going to be really important when we're doing long exposures, because if you're doing a long exposure, you press the shutter button, it can actually cause camera shake, which is going to ruin the entire exposure. So by using a delayed shutter release, I can set it, for example, to 2 seconds. I press my shutter button and it'll take 2 seconds before it actually takes the photograph, meaning there's no risk of me introducing camera shake into the scene by pressing the exposure button. But always remember to switch it off when you're done, because the next time you take a photograph, you're going to be like, well, why hasn't it taken the shot? And then suddenly it fires after 2 seconds. Just a handy tip as well, this is also incredibly useful to use with your smartphones. I find, and I think I mentioned this before, but if you're, say, at a concert and you're taking photographs, you know, instead of trying to stretch up and take a photograph of the band while also trying to press the shutter button, the exposure button, if you actually use the delayed timer, it means it gives you enough time to press the exposure button and actually raise the phone above your head to get the shot. So there's lots of different uses that you can use this for. So now we know how to control shutter speeds. Let's have a look at why we want to control shutter speeds. So let's have a look at a photograph here. So here we've got a motorcyclist that has been captured going at a very fast speed. We've captured this photograph using 500 of a second. So we've captured this motorcyclist actually driving. Everything is relatively sharp in terms of movement kind of perspective. There's not much blur happening in the photograph. Let's have a look at what happens if we were to use a slower shutter speed. So in this particular scene, we can see straight away that there is a big difference. We have a lot of blur happening in the photograph. So why is this happening? Well, we've selected a 15th of a second here in this particular instance. And what happens then in this shot is that at the start of the exposure, the motorcyclist is here, but during that 15th of a second, which, you know, still might seem very, very fast to us, but it is actually a relatively long time in terms of photography, this motorcyclist has moved this amount during that space of time. So by the time the exposure actually finishes, this is where the motorcyclist would have been. So during that 15th of a second, the motorcyclist moved that much to create this type of movement in the shot. Now, obviously, this is not the type of photograph that we want to get, but we can use this principle of capturing motion and movement with longer and shorter shutter speeds creatively. We can make creative decisions when we understand that if I use a longer shutter speed, it's going to allow motion to flow and move through the scene to create this blur effect. Or I can use a really fast shutter speed to freeze the motion and to freeze the action in the scene. let's have a look at an example of when we might do that. So here's a very, very popular way to use fast and slow shutter speeds, and that's to capture water, moving water. So we've got two different photographs here of a waterfall. As you can see here, we've got one that everything looks nice and silky and smooth, and that's because we have used a slower shutter speed, in this case a quarter of a second, which again might still seem very, very fast to you, but is plenty of time to allow the water to move through the scene so that we get this lovely kind of silky, misty type of effect on the water, compared to this other shot here where we have taken it at a 2,000th of a second, very, very fast shutter speed, and we can almost see all the individual droplets here in the scene. So neither one of these photographs is better than the other. You may have a preference as to which one you like, but it's just two different approaches now that we can take when we're making decisions about how we want to capture a scene. Do we want to blur the scene? Do we want to blur that movement by using a slower shutter speed? Or do I want to freeze it and capture all those tiny little individual details by using a very fast shutter speed? So think about this. So how might you use your fast speeds? Well, you might use them for action in sports. This is a great place, probably the first place that comes to mind really when we talk about fast shutter speeds, is to achieve photographs like this. Very intense action. Lots going on. Again, you can see all the individual droplets here of water have been captured, so a very, very fast shutter speed would have been used in this particular case. Now, just be aware as well, if you're a little bit more advanced, you can set the ISO yourself, but it is recommended that you set your ISO to auto for now. The reason for that is that ISO is going to be important when using very, very fast shutter speeds, but if we set it to auto and we're using fast shutter speeds, the camera is going to take care of that for us. If you're already a little bit more advanced, just remember to use a higher ISO in this case to ensure that you can keep your shutter speeds nice and fast. So action is definitely one place to explore using fast shutter speeds, but you can also use it, in say studio-like environments, or just think about how you might use it for your everyday photography, because shutter speeds will allow you to see things faster than we normally can see them. So even something like this where, it's just a hand clapping some flour, we get this nice kind of artistic creative effect with it by using a fast shutter speed. So simple things can become extraordinary when this movement is captured using very, very fast shutter speeds. And of course then, a terrific area to use fast shutter speeds is nature. So for capturing nature, for example, this terrific photograph of a kingfisher, and if any of you have ever tried to capture a kingfisher, you'll know how difficult it is to capture these guys. I mean, even just trying to locate where they are. I live close to a very nice river here in Dublin, and I've seen kingfishers there, and it's just so hard to get them. It's just so hard to capture them. But, if you are capturing birds or animals, that do think about using very, very fast shutter speeds, to capture these, amazing kind of intense little moments of action, within their lives. Okay, and remember, if you're using telephoto lenses as well, like we had a look at back in lesson number 3, you got to keep those shutter speeds nice and high for these types of photographs. So, do be aware of the shutter speeds that you are using. Now, looking at using slow shutter speeds, we can absolutely use them creatively as well. So something like this, a pretty mundane scene, if you think about a scene like this to our eyes, typically is going to be fairly boring, everyday, average type of scene, but we can introduce new energy to it. We can make it much more visually interesting by using a slower shutter speed. So think about this. It conveys this kind of sense of busyness, this kind of fast-paced lifestyle that we kind of live. So if you think about going to your own local high street area, where all the shoppers are, you might take a photograph there using slower shutter speeds to get this kind of fast-paced action, of our kind of busy lives where everybody's kind of just moving around each other. So slow shutter speeds are great for making something that might look a little bit boring and a little bit mundane, and just making it look much more visually interesting. And of course, slow shutter speeds can also be used with sports as well. So, we don't always have to use very, very high shutter speeds when photographing sports. Like, this is a great example of it here. We get this real tremendous sense of movement here in the shot. You get this real sense of this horse absolutely whizzing through this scene at a very, very high speed. And that's because of this blur here that we have in the background. So this is achieved by panning. We'll speak about how to do panning at the end of the lesson. But even using a shutter speed of a 30th of a second would be enough to create this type of photograph. So we don't have to go super slow with this. It doesn't have to be a slow speed of a second or 2 seconds or anything like that. But even just going to about a 30th of a second can just be slow enough to capture this type of blurred type of movement. And a very, very popular area to use slower shutter speeds is with landscape photography when photographing water. So slow shutter speeds are great to get the silky type of effect when photographing landscapes, when photographing along a shore and so on. Now for this you'll definitely need a tripod to get these slower types of shutter speeds, to get this nice silky effect. Doing this during the day is also going to be very difficult, so you want to try and do it either very early in the morning or later in the evening. You may also need what's called a neutral density filter. This is something we speak about extensively in module number 2. We have an entire lesson dedicated to landscape photography, but these will help to darken and exposure as well. But you can absolutely do this without neutral density filters. You can do this either very early in the morning when the light is still kind of low, or later in the evening when the light is going down as well. So just a few ideas there of how you can use fast and slow shutter speeds and the new kind of creative possibilities that become available to you when you understand how to use shutter speeds. Now, obviously as well, you're probably saying at this stage, well, what about the issues and the problems when using slower shutter speeds? And indeed, there are things that we need to be aware of when we are using our longer shutter speeds in particular. And one that is absolutely my pet peeve is camera shake. Now, camera shake is something that when you're beginning with photography, you're taking loads of photographs and then you're looking back at them and you're wondering, why are they not sharp? And you might start thinking, is it to do with my focusing? Am I not focusing correctly? And most likely, like nearly 99% of the time, it's actually not because of that, it's because of camera shake. So when we're photographing in the majority of situations we'd find ourselves in, say indoors, or perhaps you might be in a park, in a kind of a shady area and that, we can very, very quickly get camera shake without realizing it. That's because simply, to our eyes, it often looks like there's enough light in the scene, but to our cameras, it does not. So you really, really need to pay attention to your camera's shutter speeds. Now, camera shake can be used kind of creatively. Like you can see here, we've kind of got this impressionist type of effect here. Kind of a nice shot here with these flowers, giving this painterly type of effect by using camera shake. But in general, we don't want camera shake in our photographs because it makes everything look unsharp. So even if your focus is correct, having camera shake will make the image look wrong. So even the smallest amount of camera shake will make an image appear blurry and out of focus. So you need to always be aware of what shutter speed you are using. As a rule of thumb, as I mentioned before, you should be trying to match your shutter speed at least with the focal length that you're using. So, for example, if you're using a 50mm lens, the slowest shutter speed that you could possibly use with that is probably a 60th of a second. Anything slower than that, and you're likely to get camera shake. So you just need to be aware of this. Now, it's going to vary depending on simply on yourself, how still you can be, but also on your things like your image stabilizer or your camera's inbuilt body stabilizer as well. So just always be aware of this, that you're looking back at your photographs and you think they're looking a little bit unsharp. It may not be anything to do with your focus. It could be to do with your shutter speed. So be sure to check that, before anything else, is just to check your shutter speed. And I might be sounding a little bit overly dramatic about this, but I cannot tell you how many times I've seen people come to me saying, I can't focus, nothing's working for me, I just can't seem to get the focus right at all, and it's nothing to do with their focusing, it's all to do with their shutter speeds. So always check that first. Now, just on that as well, I will be speaking extensively about focusing in the next lesson. So if you are actually struggling with how to focus an image, don't worry, we will be speaking about that in the next lesson. But to finish off this lesson, just two very fun things that you can do with shutter speeds. So there's loads of things we can do with them, as we've seen, but this is probably one of the most satisfying types of photographs that you can do when you learn how to control shutter speeds. It's long exposure photography and doing these kind of long exposure light trails. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing you're going to want to do is have a very good tripod. So you're really going to need to be using tripods if you're using longer shutter speeds. In fact, it's essential. There's just no way around it. So on tripods, there are hundreds of types available out there. There is a tripod designed for every single camera out there. Tripods are universal, so it doesn't matter what brand you go for, it's going to fit your camera. They're designed to fit every type of camera out there. But what you do need to be aware of are the materials that are available. So there's plastic, aluminium or aluminum, and carbon fiber. Plastic are going to be cheap, but they're going to break quickly. They're not going to be able to carry a lot of weight. Aluminium are going to carry a lot of weight, but they're going to be really, really heavy themselves. They're going to be a lot to carry around. And then carbon fiber are light and can carry a lot of weight, but are really expensive. So there's kind of a lot of things there, like, there's advantages and disadvantages to all of them. So what I'd really recommend is that first of all, you need to consider weight, as you need to carry it a lot, but it also has to carry your camera. So you need to make sure you get one that's heavy enough to carry your camera, but that's still light enough to carry around. And the only way that you're going to be able to do this is to try before you buy. I don't recommend buying blindly online when it comes to a tripod. Go to your local camera shop and do a little bit of investigation to find one that works for you. You could also maybe go for this type of here, these kind of Gorilla tripods or the Flexi tripods. These can also be really, really useful because they just wrap around like tree branches or railings or anything like that. So they're very convenient in that kind of sense. But realistically, if you were to ask me what is the best brand out there, well, it's Manfrotto, and I mean, they are unfortunately the most expensive out there, but really they're the name that's kind of synonymous with tripods. Now, that's not to say there's not other great brands out there at all, like Slicker, also another great brand that are out there, Benro, but if you're after the top, it's hard to argue against Manfrotto. So do get yourself a good tripod, or at least try to borrow one if possible. Next, then you're going to want to try and find a decent location to do this. So first of all, you want to use your tripod. A cable release or delayed shutter to avoid camera shake. So as we had a look at earlier on, when you're doing long exposures like this, you can actually introduce camera shake, even if the camera is on a tripod, by pressing the exposure button. So using a cable release, if you can, or a delayed shutter release to avoid camera shake is recommended here. Select shutter priority or fully manual mode. So you can use shutter priority for this, or if you're a little bit more confident in your photography, you can use fully manual mode. But just remember, if you're using fully manual mode, you want to select a high aperture value to reduce the amount of light for a longer exposure. If you're using shutter priority, it's going to probably do this automatically anyway. But you can use manual mode, or if you're using fully manual mode, just use a high aperture number to reduce the light for a longer exposure. Again, you want to keep your ISO very low. Now, in this case, you may need to switch off your auto ISO if you're using this, because it's probably going to keep going to a high ISO value. You don't want that. So in this case, you just need to set a low ISO. Don't worry if you don't understand ISOs too much at the moment. We will talk about them, but you can, for now, just set it to 100 or 200 when you're doing a long exposure, because it'll reduce the amount of light, meaning you get longer time for your exposure. Try out different second exposures. Don't just stick with one. Try 5 seconds, try 10 seconds, try 15, try 20, try 25, try 30. Try lots of different times to see different results, to find one that best works for you. And then you also want to choose a safe location and try to choose a time when traffic is flowing. Don't go out at, say, 6 p.m. when everyone's just at a standstill and nothing's moving and nothing is happening. You want to try maybe go a little bit later on, or maybe even just a little bit earlier than that, to get that flowing movement in the scene like this. And also just be safe as well. Don't ever put yourself in harm's way when doing this. So, for example, say you're photographing trams, if you're in a European city that has trams, like say Lisbon or Austria or Vienna, even in Dublin, the Lewis in Dublin, they make a great long exposure type of photograph. But obviously, you just want to put yourself in a position where you're not in any harm's way, or you're not putting anybody else in any kind of harm either. Always try to choose somewhere safe for you and everybody else around you as well. Something else that you can also try out, though, using longer shutter speeds, which is also really, really cool, is panning. So we had a look at this briefly earlier on with the image of our horse. So panning is basically when we're using a slightly slower shutter speed and we're matching the movement of the subject that we're photographing. So, for example, here we've got a photograph of a runner. So what's happening here is that the photographer is moving, the camera is moving the lens along at the same speed roughly as your moving subject. So you're following your subject along. But if we're using a slower shutter speed, so around a 60th of a second or a 30th of a second, these should be enough. We'll get this blurred background. Now, it also helps to use a tripod or a monopod to keep the shot steady while you're panning, while you're moving along with the subject, okay? But also sitting and crouching also helps to steady the shot at these shutter speeds. So if you haven't got a tripod available to you, you can still try this out by simply sitting or crouching just to steady your body even more. And try to choose an interesting background so you can actually see the movement. Don't just have a grey brick wall or something like that, but try to choose something nice and interesting here to really get this kind of sense of movement in the scene. And shutter priority is a very good option for this as well. So simply select shutter priority. Don't need to worry too much about your other settings in this case. It's more just making sure that you're kind of moving along roughly at the same speed that whatever subject it is that you're photographing, that you're panning along with them. So there's just a few other things that you can do with your shutter speeds. Lots and lots for you to try out now after this lesson. So I expect to see some really good photographs on the Facebook page. But before we get to that, let's have a look, as always, at what's coming up in the next lesson. So we're going to be talking all about our cameras, or I should say our lenses apertures, in the next lesson. So apertures control the volume of light. We'll have a look at exactly how they work in the next lesson. They also control depth of field in the scene, which is the out of focus area in a photograph. And this is something that we use very, very frequently, particularly when we're photographing, say, macro or portraits. We'll learn how we can control that depth of field. And finally, then, as I mentioned, we'll also have a look at how to focus. And focusing can be tricky, but I'll have a look at some simple techniques that you can use that will make sure that, you'll get it right every single time. Now, before we wrap up this lesson, I want to talk to you about the bigger picture and the places that photography and education have taken me, and with the right help can take you. Education changed my life, and it can change yours as well. And this is my story. I want to give you a little bit of perspective in terms of where I came from, how I got to this stage with my photography, and how education was the key to unlocking my potential. So my story begins back to when I was in and around 15 and I got my first camera, and I was taking photographs using a film camera, Nikon F65. And I found that when I was getting my roles of film back that I wasn't really getting the results that I was hoping for. So I started doing part-time education, nighttime education actually, while I was still in secondary school. And this is a great way for me to get started in photography, but I had to work part-time on top of school to pay for it as well. So I was paying for it out of my own pocket. Moving on from that though, I had discovered that from doing that nighttime course that photography was really something that I wanted to do, that I wanted it to become my career. So I made the decision that I was going to go and apply to do this in college. But before I could do that, I also needed to build out a portfolio. So in a bit of a catch-22, to get into college, you need to have a photography portfolio. So I enrolled in a one-year portfolio course. This was great, but I also felt that a year was perhaps a little bit too long for this, but it was still a great experience. But very successful from that, and that did get me into college. I was able to get into my BA in photography. 4 years it took me to study photography in college, and it was a very mixed experience. The whole college life is great. The people I met there, they're friends for life, but I still had to work to pay my way through. This created a lot of pressure with deadlines. It was very, very stressful, particularly in my 4th year. And I also found that my educators, they weren't there when I needed them. They were very difficult to get in contact to. They were very difficult to get responses from. And again, particularly in my final year, I felt a huge amount of pressure while trying to work on top of everything else. But ultimately, it was worthwhile. I left college and I entered the workforce for a number of years, working as a freelance photographer and working in camera shops. But I did find myself stuck in a little bit of a rut. So I decided to go back and get educated even more, because I felt that education was always the way to unlocking doors, always the way to progress forward and achieve what I wanted to achieve. And I decided that I wanted to teach photography, and the way to do that was to get an MFA, a Master's in Fine Art in Photography. And I went and I studied that. I had to save up a lot of money to do that. Very, very expensive. And again, very mixed experience. During that MFA, a lot of pressure, but also very, very much you were out on your own doing all of this work and had occasional contact with your educators. So it was a lot of money for what I felt was a minimal amount of engagement from my educators, and that was a bit of a frustrating experience. But in the end, I got my MFA, I was qualified to teach, and now I am here teaching you. I joined Shaw Academy. So education unlocked my potential, it opened up doors for me. However, there is a caveat to all of this. As great as education is, it is flawed. And let's be real, education is, first of all, very expensive. I had to save a lot to complete my studies, and many times I did feel like it was not worth it. And unfortunately, for many people all over the world, they either simply cannot afford it or they go into crazy debt just to get themselves educated. These kind of stories we're all familiar with people paying off student loans for the majority of their lives. And even when you can afford it, as I mentioned, it is a flawed experience. Lectures don't happen at your convenience. Quite the opposite. In fact, it can be very, very difficult to work around lectures if you are also working, if you're also employed as well. And it's also very, very difficult to get in contact with your educators. It's also a deeply time-consuming experience. Like during my master's, I had to travel to Belfast from Dublin, so that was 2 hours to and from college for only 1 day a week. And to me, that was the craziest part about it. I mean, even if there had been 2 days a week of studying, I could have done that master's in half the amount of time. So having been through the university experience, like many of you, while ultimately worthwhile, it is a deeply flawed and frustrating experience, and something now that at my age, if I decided to do it again, I don't think I would. It was just too expensive and too time consuming. But it doesn't have to be like this. Education doesn't have to be expensive and inflexible. And when I was studying, I really wish something like Shaw Academy had been around. Our mission here in Shaw Academy is to provide to you convenient, flexible, affordable, interactive and internationally recognized education. We are offering you higher education at a lower cost in a way that allows you